smart cities has been about the potential and, but it's time we need to actualize that potential and realize it. In terms of trying to quantify it, we always think about in terms of, we've got a triangle of things we try to hit with our projects is, are there going to be efficiencies? Are there going to be cost savings that can, as you say, measure? Can we measure the impact on the community? And I should have started with that. That's obviously the most important one. And that could be, as you say, it could be confidence in local authorities. It could be the number of complaints. It could be journey times through a city. It could be any number of things. And then lastly, the wider economic benefits to the city and the wider economy.
Hi, Smart Community friends. In this episode of the Smart Community Podcast, I have a super interesting conversation with Michael Healy, the Smart Cities Program Manager at Christchurch City Council. And Michael tells us all about what smart community things are happening in Christchurch. Michael starts by telling us about his diverse background and how this led into several continuous improvement roles. He also shares with us his passion for making people's lives and communities better through more efficient processes. He also then talks about how he transitioned into his current role with the City of Christchurch. Michael then shares with us what a smart community is to him and the wide range of projects he is currently working on, before sharing with us how the City of Christchurch began its smart community journey. We then discuss the return on investment of smart community initiatives and whether they can be measured and how, and should smart communities be a core service of governments and councils. We finish our chat discussing the emerging trends of the agri-tech space in New Zealand and its progression. We also talk about aerospace and satellite imagery and how these can be used to collect data. And lastly, we talk about micro-positioning and how these all contribute to improving smart communities. As always, we hope you enjoy listening to this episode as much as we enjoyed making it.
Welcome to the smart community, smart regions, smart towns, and smart cities. It's where we live, work, and play. With smart communities, the future starts today. Big data, smart mobility, emerging trends galore. The Smart Community Podcast is what you're looking for.
Hello, Michael. How are you today?
Good, thanks, Zoe. Yeah, great. Thank you. Lovely day here in New Zealand. And thank you very much for having me onto the podcast. Really appreciate the chance to talk about what we're doing here in Christchurch.
I'm so excited to have you. And it's quite a nice day here over the ditch. But yes, I'm really excited to come to New Zealand sometime very soon. But anyway, we won't talk about that yet. We'll talk about you. So tell us about your background and what you're passionate about.
Yeah, well, as you may or may not tell from my accent, I'm originally from Ireland. I was born there and lived my early years in a small rural town in the southwest of Ireland, and then came over to Christchurch in New Zealand in the late 80s. Went to high school here, went to uni, tried pretty much every course that was available, and then decided that wasn't for me, and then went traveling and went back to Ireland, lived in England, traveled the world. And I suppose didn't have a clear vocation and kind of worked, all sorts of things in kitchens, HR, customer service, and I even led a payroll team. But it was while I was leading the payroll team, I found out about Lean Six Sigma, and I trained up and got qualified, and then spent about 10 years doing different continuous improvement roles. So in parallel to this, doing that role at council, the Smart Cities program had started about 5 years ago. And I've been kind of watching interest in, from the outside, going, wow, they're doing some cool stuff. And then through a bit of serendipity and chance, I joined the team around 2 years ago and then became program manager pretty quickly afterwards.
Yeah, excellent.
Yeah. And and CI I thought it was my vocation or the end vocation. But on reflection, it's quite internally focused, a lot of internal conversations, both with Smart Cities. You're well and truly got that 360-degree kind of, approach. So, and really enjoy it and getting out and about talking to different people.
Mm. So you've done a lot of different things. Where does your passion lie?
Well, I think it's about making changes to people's lives fundamentally. And I suppose in the past that was with people's work lives, freeing them up to do more interesting work and kind of cutting out the dumb stuff. But with smart cities, with a community focus, it's just really about making, a better community to live and work and play in. And I suppose with time, I'm increasingly becoming more passionate about looking at options to tackle the big problems that face us. And again, probably sounds a bit cheesy, but I suppose thinking about greenhouse gas emissions, waste management. So increasingly, we're kind of doing things in that space that, again, are looking at those bigger problems or challenges.
Yeah, and I guess there's some really big challenges that are already here and heading our way. And I think, I agree with you. I think as much as it might, I don't think it sounds cheesy, but actually tackling some of these big problems with a smart community approach, I think is really important. We will go to what is a smart community to you, but first, I'm keen to hear how you went from continuous improvement into smart cities. And to me, that sounds like quite a natural progression. And I've talked to some other people on the podcast who are still sitting in that continuous improvement place. And then that's where they're doing their smart cities, projects and approaches. So how was that transition for you?
Yeah, I suppose, and thinking back, I suppose, to the genesis of my interest in technology and smart cities and smart communities. So as a kid, we used to watch a program in Ireland called Tomorrow's World that was made by the BBC, and that showed us all the amazing technology and innovation that was happening. This is in the 80s. And it was my favorite program on TV. And then, growing up, I loved sci-fi and, in literature and movies. And and reading about dystopian visions of the world was quite formative in terms of 1984 and Blade Runner, as well as great entertainment and allegories. It was also made you think about what a city shouldn't be in the future. And so gave a very clear vision of where we had to avoid going to. So, as I said, with continuous improvement, the biggest bang for buck, or, most satisfaction you got was actually making changes to process that benefited people, that created efficiencies and just kind of got rid of the dumb stuff. But it was a very internally focused kind of role. And we obviously, put a lot of work into getting insights of what the community wanted and tried to instill a true end-to-end view with the parts of the business we worked with. But we didn't actually get out to interact with the community that much ourselves or to talk to the wider community in terms of innovation community. Sorry to be clear on that. So when the opportunity came up to join Smart Cities, my predecessor, Teresa McCullum, the way she sold it to me, she said, this just gives you a much wider remit. It gives you a chance to talk to the people that you're working to improve things for and learn from a range of people. And she kind of hit the nail on the head. It's smart cities space and smart community is very challenging, and not just from my own experience, but looking at other people in this space, there's a lot of things to be across. There's a lot of people to get to know and to network and keep the relationships up. There's a lot of communication and marketing of your function you've got to do. So certainly the hardest role I've ever done. But on the flip side, the good parts of it kind of really hit home. You achieve real change, or the community is really excited about what you're doing. It kind of makes it all worthwhile. But I say it's not for the light-hearted.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think we were talking, just kind of in the pre-chat around there's so many interesting things in the space, but there's also, the back of house stuff and the kind of everyday BAU stuff that still needs to happen to make the smart things happen. And I think sometimes we might forget about that. But yeah, it is really interesting. I think there are so many different disciplines within the space. And sometimes, particularly, I assume, in a council and talking to councils, you're like the stop for all of those things. Whereas you then have to then go, oh, okay, translate that into what does that mean for communications, marketing, technology, the IT department, the managerial space, the HR space. So it's like this, it is a complex kind of role when you really break it down into how many different things you need to know, not necessarily off the top of your head, but you need to know who the people are that you need to talk to get the best outcome.
Completely agree. I mean, you've got to be a contract manager, a project manager, a financial expert, procurement guru. You've got to be up au fait with legal matters. You really become a jack of all trades. And I think the nature of people probably getting into smart cities is we've got this deep FOMO. We don't want to miss out on an opportunity or an ability to make a difference. So I think, well, speaking from personal experience, I find it very hard to say no. But I think that's probably a common attribute to the people who get into this industry.
Yeah, I think you're right in that space. I haven't thought about it like that before, but yes, I concur. I definitely concur. Excellent. I want to dive into what Christchurch is doing, but let's lift out a little bit first and go, what is a smart community to you?
I suppose fundamentally it's around building an environment and culture where we work together to find innovative solutions to the things that matter most to the community. Because if we're not focused on those things, then we're not doing what we're paid to do. And I suppose in thinking, it's like the old issues like running a city, infrastructure management, transport, and then also tackling the emerging and future problems and challenges and opportunities. But a lot of it is about can-do culture and collaborating and people being open to an innovative mindset. And that goes right across the community.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the mindset is really important. I'm speaking at a conference next week in Victoria, and it's one of the key things that, I'm going to talk about is the mindset, and the language that we use is as important as the technology that we choose. Because if you don't have that, if you're thinking, oh, this can't work, this is impossible, I don't want to change anything, we've always done it this way, then no amount of smart technology will help us move forward. It's not a magic solution. So thanks so much for bringing that up. And I like that you were talking, I guess, from a council perspective, what are the things that we can do now that then benefit the community later on? And there's a whole suite of things, like you said, from running the city to the new things that are coming and having a bit of foresight into what things are coming our way. So I think it's a really good approach to take and definition of a smart community. Okay, let's talk about you. Let's talk about Christchurch. Tell us about some of your favourite projects and things that you've been working on.
Yeah, well, we've got a range, and again, thinking of how stretched we are in terms of what we're trying to achieve. We've got the kind of typical smart cities, things like pedestrian counting, free Wi-Fi, digital twin. And then in the IoT space, there's a couple of projects, I suppose, point of difference. One of them is around a project where we put 150 seismic sensors across the city. New Zealand and Christchurch very seismically active, and we had a major event here about 10 years ago. And one of the issues that was very difficult to manage through the main event and aftershocks was knowing when buildings were safe to occupy. And we had a lot of cases where we had people in buildings for months, libraries and service centres. And then after an engineer did an inspection, we had to get everyone out pretty quickly. So that's not great from a public perspective, but also we closed buildings that might have needed to be closed. So with the seismic sensors, within about a couple of minutes of an earthquake, and they still happen, unfortunately, here, we take the information from the 150 sensors and the local information about the building in terms of its building strength, and then ground conditions, and basically we send a text to our building wardens to say the building's safe or minor damage or you need to evacuate and so on and so forth. So that was a world first. That project's been running for nearly 3 years now, and Wellington's put their own sensor network up, which is great, but a really cool project, and I suppose one of the cornerstone projects of the program. Another good one we're doing at the moment is around fire detection sensors. And this is one where we looked to Latrobe Valley in Victoria, and they had major forest fires over the years, but there was a infamous incident of a mine that caught fire from the forest fire. So you had a massive issue with this coal mine burning for months and months. But one of the things they did to tackle issues like that, or, to hopefully improve the chances of it not happening in future, were to put in a range of fire detection sensors. And they take thermal imagery and they take particulate sensors data, and they kind of say, look, there's an early stage of the fire here, notifies the fire services automatically and the park staff. So we're going to be the first council to trial that in New Zealand in a plantation at the north of the city. A lot of houses around it, a lot of recreational users, and it's had fires in the past. And there's a lot of firebug activity there too. So, really cool project, but a good example of looking overseas and trying to learn from that and adapt it to a local context. And I suppose, as we talked about a wee bit earlier, sustainability is obviously an increasing focus for local authorities and a lot of organisations. So we're working on things like our greenhouse gas public portal. So that's a way to show public how we're tracking against our major targets. So Christchurch, in 2030, we want to have our greenhouse gas emissions and by 2050 be carbon neutral. That's pretty, that's a huge task, and we want to find a way to easily tell that story to the public. So that's been good because you take very granular data about fuel use and EV ownership and all sorts of other things, and then you sum it up into a metric that actually means something to the public. Then we can kind of activate the community to kind of change behaviours, get on your bicycle, think about how you heat your home, etc. Yeah, and another sustainable related one we're doing is with a local startup, a woman who's created a bioreactor and a special concoction of microbes that takes polluted river water, removes the contaminants, and then spits out clean water. So again, a nice world first is happening locally, and she was looking for partners to trial this locally. So she's going to trial it with some iwi here on farms to remove nitrates from water, which is quite a big issue here in New Zealand. And then in the city environment, we'll put it in the main river that runs through the city and in one of the wetlands. We've recently, wetland basin we've created over the past couple of years to test the technology. So, yeah, there's a lot of different things we work on. We've also recently worked on a graffiti recognition project where we take all the photos we get from the public to look for signatures and tags and track offenders across the city. And yeah, gives you a kind of taste of some of the things we're working on.
Yeah, no, and quite a range of things. And I know that you've got so many other things as well. You might not be able to answer this because I know you haven't been there since the very beginning. So I'm going to ask it anyway, and we'll chop it out if it doesn't work. I'm really keen to hear how Christchurch started their journey. That's a question that I get quite a lot from local governments. Like, what do we actually do to start? Is there any insights you can share on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, in Christchurch's case, the central government partnered with NEC, the technology company, to actually seed fund smart cities activity in Auckland, Wellington, and Christchurch, the three main centres. And so we got a third of that money, and our predecessor basically started the program. She was a one-person show. She used that seed funding to get some runs on the board. I suppose unsurprisingly, with NEC being involved, there was a heavy technological IoT component there. But after that, she then went through the council process to get funding for the program for a 5-year period. And that 5-year period is coming to a close now. And for this planning round, the long-term planning process that happens every 3 years in New Zealand, we've asked for the program to be permanently funded effectively, and to have a small capex budget associated with the program that we can invest in kind of key technology, I suppose, a bit like things like the bioreactor, smart stuff that's been developed locally, and see if we can springboard it onto a national and global stage. But yeah, you're right. Someone's going to have to stump up with some funding to make things happen. And I know in New Zealand, there's a lot of small councils, and there's a CIO or somebody in the marketing team who takes an interest in smart cities and does it as part of their day job. So, a lot of people just have an interest at GM, or they've got an interest in themselves, and they start small and build up. But sooner or later, you're going to have to get some funding. And I suppose we've been looking, probably like a lot of different councils, what are other funding sources other than going through the local authority? You could try to commercialize some of your offerings and license it across the globe. Look for, investors locally and overseas. So there's many different ways you can cut it, but it does cost money. I mean, we do make a little bit of money go a long way. And I think people in the smart city space typically are very ingenious about getting the most out of it. But having a good sponsor is a huge positive, obviously, as well. If you get a mayor or a CE or a GM that's quite influential who has your back and shares your vision, then that's always extremely helpful.
Yeah, and I've been thinking a lot about the benefits of smart cities or smart communities, so the actual return on investment. We talk a lot about, needing funding, but I've been doing a bit of research on that return on investment. And sometimes it's not, dollars that's the return, it's the increased quality of life. But I feel like then you can measure things like, economic activity and all those other things as well. Do you think we're at a point where we can actually measure that return on investment?
Yeah, definitely. And I think we're at a point where we have to, otherwise our funding will dry up. I think, smart cities has been about the potential and, but it's time we need to actualize that potential and realize it. In terms of trying to quantify it, we always think about in terms of, we've got a triangle of things we try to hit with our projects is, are there going to be efficiencies? Are there going to be cost savings that can, as you say, measure? Can we measure the impact on the community? And I should have started with that. That's obviously the most important one. And that could be, as you say, it could be confidence in local authorities. It could be the number of complaints. It could be journey times through a city. It could be any number of things. And then lastly, the wider economic benefits to the city and the wider economy. So again, if you're supporting a local startup or a local innovator, then that's if you can hit all three of those, then you're onto a winner. But you're right, it can be challenging to measure that, but a bit like continuous improvement, if you put your head to it, the metrics are there. It's just agreeing on which metrics you should be measuring.
No, I like that you've brought it back to that continuous improvement, because that makes sense to people that we want to continuously improve, and there are metrics that you find that that are there that you draw out because you know that you need to have you need to improve continuously. And so I think that's interesting. I think exactly what you were saying there, those kind of three areas, but also to be able to do that, you need a baseline, right? So you need to know, well, what is it now? And I think that's sometimes where we maybe forget to measure that baseline first when we start off in this, and that's okay. We'll come back, we'll do that. But I think now that we've moved along in our maturity of smart cities and communities, measuring that baseline will be so important. So then we can actually say, well, this is the benefit we got, not just the potential is this, and, we're hoping for that and whatever, because that won't cut it anymore with, exactly like you were saying, funding and all those type of things. You can't fund aspiration potentially. I don't know, maybe you can, but actually then measuring that.
It's a tough conversation, especially with your finance team. They can be your harshest critics and your hardest audience. But you're competing against core services, like keeping toilets running and water and keeping libraries open and parks and obviously roads free of potholes. There's a lot of stuff there that's competing for public money. So you're completely right. You have to tie it into how you're helping deliver those individual services better.
Yeah, and that's a really good point too, that it's about integrating that in with, making it a core service why are you actually doing this? It's to deliver something better, or it's to improve the efficiency of, potholes, repair, or whatever the case may be, asset management. It's improving or maintaining the relevancy of libraries so more people are using them, where space is being utilised so then you can plan better, et cetera, et cetera. So, you're right. You need to tell that story. And it's not just a story that you've made up. It's based on data and evidence, and then being able to have that baseline to measure and monitor, and then be able to say, well, actually, here's the real return on investment. Yeah,
and I think what you said there about making it a core part of councils and organisations and government is key. I reflect on the planning process we're going through that I mentioned before. Like, we've made a point of putting resilience as a core theme through that whole process, which I think is great and it's amazing. I think the challenge for us would be to put smart communities, smart cities through the core of that process next time round. And I know Sean Adain in Wellington has been doing that there, up in Wellington quite well. So I think that'll be the challenge for Christchurch and probably a lot of other councils. Just make it core. It's part of what we do. Innovation is just, part of our DNA. So,
yeah. Our good friend Sean, yes, I was trying to remember when he was on the podcast, so we'll have to find it and I'll put it in the show notes. But it was quite a while ago now, so he will have to come back on very soon. Okay, this has been really great. I've really enjoyed this. Let's zoom into the future now. And can you tell us about the emerging trends that people aren't talking about enough?
Yeah, and that is a tough question because I'm not a futurist, and you've got to be really careful to call yourself a smart cities expert because somebody will pull you up on that. But I suppose reflecting from a New Zealand perspective, we're really excited about some of the things that are happening in an agri-tech space because New Zealand agriculture is a massive component of our economy, and it's also a massive environmental risk and issue for us too. So we've got some really good local innovators thinking about how we take waste and turning it into a valuable resource that can be recycled and reused. A good example I saw last week was a young inventor who was taking wool, shearing offcuts and reducing it into tiny pellets that are equivalent to plastic pellets and making things that traditionally you'd make plastic. And he actually brought a catamaran onto stage to display, and it was made out of wool. And I thought, wow, that's amazing. We've got plastic is obviously a massive issue. Imagine if we were making plastic with animal fiber or plant fiber that would, could be safely disposed of, or that would, just degrade naturally without polluting waterways. Aerospace, there's a lot of cool stuff happening, again, in New Zealand and across the world. I suppose you've got like cube satellites and rocketry, but on a more terrestrial level, we've got a local company here called Kia Atmos that is creating a plane that the wingspan would be the width of a house, but it's solar powered and it'll stay up in the atmosphere for up to 6 months, taking really high quality imagery and data collection. That's really exciting because currently satellite imagery has a quite limited definition, and if you want detailed definition from the sky, you've got to put a plane up, which is environmentally not very friendly and quite expensive. So to have a fleet of those vehicles in the air above cities and countries permanently means you can react to emergencies really quickly. You can detect emerging issues very quickly. And it's just you can manage a traffic network across your city with that information. So quite excited about that. And another technology relatively recently heard about was in terms of micro-positioning, in terms of kind of getting the next generation GPS and satellites again have limitations to knowing your exact location or the location of a drone or the location of a car. And micro-position technology basically enables you to determine that within, I think, 5 or 10 centimeters. So, there are a few of the things I've just been hearing about recently that kind of make me excited. But I suppose the stuff, again, that makes me most excited, a bit like that wool product that you can use for the equivalent of plastic construction, that's a game changer. That's taking something that we'd normally throw out and replacing a material that's really, degrading to the environment. So and even things like taking seaweed and feeding it to cows and reducing 90% of your methane emissions. For countries like New Zealand, in terms, a lot of our greenhouse gas and methane is particularly dangerous, comes from agriculture. So to hear about people just coming up with very smart and sustainable ways to actually reduce issues like that, that's probably the most exciting things I've been hearing about recently.
Yeah, and I like that, we talked about some of the emerging trends with technology, but other things are just thinking a bit differently. And that's what the Smart Community Space is about. It's not just technology, but what are the other things that we can do that aren't how we've always done it, or we've learned from that and then we've shifted it, we've changed it to, I guess, move more towards the outcomes that we want rather than the ones where we're heading to. So, really interesting. Well, Michael, it's been so great to chat with you. Thank you so much for coming onto the podcast. I really enjoyed our conversation, and I think we do have a lot more to talk about, so I'll have to come over and visit. Hopefully we still have a bubble when I can come over.
That'd be great. It would be our pleasure to have you, and we'd look forward to showing off the city. There's a lot of cool stuff happening here. So just let us know when you're coming. We'll put on a show.
Sounds good. Okay, one last question, which is how can people connect with you?
Probably LinkedIn is the most straightforward way, so just look for myself there. Check out one of our data sharing platforms called smartview.ccc.govt.nz. heaps of interesting data sets, but you can also connect with us and give us feedback on the tool. And then lastly, if you can email smartchristchurch@ccc.govt.nz. So, yeah, if there's anything you want to talk about, any other projects, or if you want to collaborate or connect, just hit us up. And we're always keen to connect.
Excellent. We will put all the links in the show notes so people can click away and find you. Thank you again for coming onto the podcast, and I look forward to talking to you again soon.
Great. Thanks, Zoe.
Thanks, Michael. Bye.
Bye.
The Smart Community Podcast is brought to you by My Smart Community. If you're looking for support in podcast strategy and production, workshop design and facilitation, or communication and media advisory, get in touch. Email hello@mysmart.community or head to www.mysmart.community.
Thanks so much for listening to the Smart Community Podcast. Show notes for this episode and all other episodes are available on our website, mysmart.community/podcast. If you have any questions for us or any of our guests, you can email hello@mysmart.community. You can also find us on the socials. We are on LinkedIn and Twitter @SmartComHQ. That's com with 2 M's. If you are enjoying the podcast, please hit subscribe so you never miss an episode. And we would love for you to leave us a rating and review at wherever you listen. This really helps us reach more ears and eyes, so thank you for your support. As always, we hope you enjoyed listening to this episode as much as we enjoyed making it.
The Smart Community Podcast is what you're looking for.